I'm going to argue it here, and if you know me, I argue it all the time, right? This starts with this dichotomous idea of us and them that is established through these sorts of capitalist divisions, right? This is largely due, this division of individuals is largely due to the fact that community gardens, like overcoming this, right, this type of activism, is largely due to the fact that community gardens foster a sense of stewardship that is otherwise lacking in the way most people relate to their environment. Whereas capitalism has perpetuated a top-down ideology of domination derived from a despotic interpretation of creation, a neo-Marxist resistance ought to foster a sense of personal stewardship of the natural environment as both the place we live and the place from whence our sustenance comes. More, the stewardship interpretation of creation does not only subvert the dominant paradigm, but it is also a critique of an absolutist concept of property. We are all responsible for the garden. Stewardship, as it is fleshed out in terms of the ideal and practices of good farming, becomes a critique of capitalist notions of productivity as well, since good farming techniques are not industrial, at least not in a capitalist sense, right? But more importantly, they include notions of fallowness and wildness, which are inherently unproductive. This is why capitalism does not want you to be a good steward, right? Good stewards are productive in ways that are not profitable. And if your productivity is not profitable, capitalism is not happy, right? And then capitalists have problems, okay? And so this is part of why I think a Marxist narrative is really beneficial in learning how to use the environment as a site of subversion, because it allows us to be productive without being profitable, at least not directly for capitalists, okay? There is a sense of belonging that is transcendent of the human experience as an exclusive position of importance to be replaced with one that is inclusive of the human as a natural being whose existence is a part of nature rather than apart from nature. Okay, and so the way I'm going to argue that we have to do that is through Epicurus, right? So Marx is going to give us the motivation and kind of the framework, and I think Epicurus is going to give us the desire. If we're going to undertake the difficult work of reducing, reusing, recycling, and reclaiming, then it matters how we rank order our desires just as much as it matters how those desires are formed and created by our socio-political experience. One of the major problems with desire is that it is bound up with notions of consumption, and capitalists have successfully tethered notions of consumption to notions of disposal. Our current throwaway culture is well hidden behind a carefully constructed eco-conscious facade, a fact laid bare by the fact that consumers' environmental footprints continue to climb, despite poll after poll reporting that large majorities declare their allegiance to environmental values. This is achieved at least in part through industry-sponsored green initiatives that are not actually green. Right? Practices which, embedded as they are in the capitalist notion of consumption, allow the average consumer to participate in eco-conscious behavior while entirely failing to achieve any real environmental change. Because the government is as complicit in the capitalism that shapes and controls the social and political, it is unlikely that we will find a reprieve generating from those in positions of power. And here's where I would tell you to overthrow the government and start from scratch, right? Like that's what I'm supposed to say, so I said it because it's true, right? Burn this shit down. However, individually reconstituting our desire relationship to the world, and especially to the world of consumption, is something that we can do. Unfortunately, it is what those people at the lowest strata of the socioeconomic hierarchy have been forced to do by necessity. And this is where I would argue that lower income families and destitute communities ought to be at the fore of the revolution and not the people that we're dragging along with us. This is part of the inversion of the social order, right? You have to let the people who know how to combat capitalism lead the charge against capitalism. It's rarely the case that the middle class is going to really tear down capitalism. They still benefit from it. But poor folk, not so much. Right? And so that's part of creating this new sense of community, is figuring out how to take your activism into a sphere where you become an ally and not a general, right? You got to let these people lead the revolution. They just need to know they've got support. At least that's the way I think of it. There is something to be taken from the difficulty present in the struggle to persist in a capitalist-dominated social order, right? Something invaluable in terms of leadership. Of utmost importance is the idea of the community, one that is central to both Marx and Epicurean thought, neither of which, however, is capable on its own in our current social milieu of revolutionizing resistance to capitalism. The community garden, right, that's Epicurus, right, Epicurus and his garden, can provide a site for the synthesis of the ideas that could make modern resistance to capitalism more effective, both socially and environmentally. By focusing on communal gardening practices, I could advocate for a green Marxism that is linked to the social philosophy of Epicurus to produce a critique of global capitalism as unsustainable. That should come as a shock to no one. A materialist ecology is evident in Epicurean thought, and this worldview has influential tendrils in Marx's own concerns about the metabolic separation of humans from nature. Epicurus teaches that happiness is found in a proper ordering of desires, and chief among the desires all humans have are those that are natural and necessary. The ability of the garden in Epicurean thought to provide for these desires is a major anchor of Epicureanism, along with the central tenet of Epicurus' philosophy that what is good is easy to get. This is in contrast to the idea that some desires, those that are unnatural and unnecessary, ought to be pursued in moderation only and often avoided. Not avoided at all costs, because that makes for a pretty dull existence, but definitely with an eye toward the corruptibility of humans who too often overindulge. The same idea finds parallels in Plato's Republic when Glaucon levels his City of Pigs critique against the first formulation of Callipolis. Socrates offers in the Republic when he gives his account of the perfect or ideal city. And then Glaucon says, whoa, dude, that sounds horrible. That sounds like a city for pigs. And Socrates says, well, what do you want? Glaucon says, couches and sauces, man. What are you doing? And Socrates says, oh, man, if you want luxuries, you're going to have a sick city. And if we're going to have a sick city, we have to rethink what justice is going to look like in a perfect, ideal city, right? And so then you get the rest of the Republic, because Glaucon's an elitist, right? Otherwise, it would only be 2 chapters long, just FYI, right? So for Epicurus, if you're hungry, eat an apple, right? Not only is it easy to get, but it's natural to be hungry, and it's necessary to satisfy that urge, and apples are delicious. Plucking an apple from a branch takes care of the hunger at minimal cost with maximal satisfaction. Apple pies, contrarily, are unnatural and unnecessary. And believe me when I say it pains me to say that. But on occasion, an apple just is not what you want. So apple pie is okay. And you got to think about this in Epicurean ways, right? Plucking an apple that's ready to eat. It's not just that apple pie is unnatural and unnecessary. You got to have butter and sugar and flour and heat and a whole bunch of stuff, right? It is an endeavor to make an apple pie, right? It's an undertaking. But plucking an apple in the garden, no, you can do that in just a matter of minutes, right? Even if you have to shimmy up the tree a bit. Today, we are an apple pie society, especially in the West, but the ability of community gardens to not only feed people, though it is a simple diet to be sure, the act of gardening together in order to provide for everyone is at its most basic a form of resistance. The community garden is a way of repurposing public property. It is a way of reconnecting people to the land that feeds them and the natural world they live in. It is a radical act of reclamation of both the environment and the idea of community. An idea that capitalism cannot foster because it is at odds with the very idea of community. Right, so let me give you, just in conclusion, I just want to say a couple of things about people who are doing this, like places this has happened, things you should know about, right? And this part of the talk can be linked to people you're probably familiar with, Wendell Berry, Wes Jackson, Aldo Leopold. They all talk about kind of a return to the land in important ways. But it also links into sort of neo-Marxian ideas of the great refusal, right? How to respond to capitalism. So first and foremost, you should be familiar with Braddock Farms in Braddock, Pennsylvania, which were started by a gentleman named John Fetterman, who, if you've ever looked this guy up, looks like he just walked out of a Hells Angels meeting. He's a Harvard-educated Marxist activist. He's got a leather jacket, lots of tattoos, he rides a motorcycle, and one day he decided that the steel industry pulling up and leaving town sucked, and he was going to do something about it. He became the mayor, he knocked down a bunch of buildings, and he planted a bunch of gardens, and anybody who works in the gardens gets free groceries out of them. right? So it's like a work for your own co-op situation. They started with 2, now they have like 3 acres. They started with just 2 little blocks, and now they're everywhere. Some of them are indoor, some of them are outdoor, and everybody pitches in and everybody reaps the reward, and it's a total communal effort. That's been going on now for a decade in Braddock, Pennsylvania. It started in 2007.